The old man's hands were shaking when he set the badge down on the glass. Not trembling the way hands do when you're cold or nervous. Shaking the way hands shake when they've made a decision they never thought they'd have to make. The kind of shaking that means something inside already broke before the body caught up. The pawn shop on Decatur Street smelled like machine oil and old leather, the kind of place that holds on to things people let go of. Military ribbons in a display case near the door. A trumpet nobody played anymore. Wedding rings lined up like little gravestones. Outside, the rain came down hard and diagonal, the way summer rain in Georgia does. Not apologetic, not gentle, just committed to soaking everything in its path. The man behind the counter, a heavy-set white man named Sproul, who had been taking other people's necessities and calling it commerce for 23 years, looked at the badge on the glass and didn't touch it right away. Department of the Year, he read. Atlanta Fire Rescue, 2003. The man on the other side of the counter said nothing. His name was Otis Fenn, 61 years old, 28 years as a firefighter, the last 9 as a battalion chief before his left knee gave out and the department gave him a ceremony and a handshake and sent him home to a fixed income that didn't account for the cost of insulin in 2026. Otis Fenn did not look like what he was. He was wearing a rain jacket that had seen better decades. His boots were dry but cracked. He'd driven 40 minutes to this particular pawn shop because he didn't want to walk into one where somebody might recognize him. Sproul turned the badge over, examined the back. I can do 40. Otis kept his face the way he'd learned to keep it in burning buildings. Still. Controlled. Giving nothing away. That badge got a letter from the mayor attached to it, Otis said. When it was given. I don't have the letter, Sproul said. I have the badge. $40. That was what 28 years of running into structures other men ran out of was worth, according to the economy of Decatur Street on a Wednesday afternoon. Fine, Otis said. That word, fine, cost him more than he showed. He had driven past 3 of his old firehouses on the way here. Station 4, where he'd started at 23, so green, he'd held a hose wrong his first live burn, and his lieutenant grabbed it out of his hands without a word, just shook his head, and positioned Otis's grip like a man adjusting a child's pencil hold. Station 11, where he pulled a 4-year-old girl out of a burning apartment on Bankhead, and she'd grabbed his neck and held on so tight he could still feel the impression of her small fingers if he thought about it hard enough. Station 19, where he'd made battalion chief and his crew had put a banner on the garage door that said Chief Fenn in red letters, and when he saw it, he'd had to go into the bathroom for 2 minutes because he was not going to cry in front of a crew of 26 firefighters. He'd driven past all 3 and not stopped. Now he was standing in a pawn shop, watching a man he'd never met put his badge on a scale like it was scrap metal. Here is what Sproul did not know about Otis Fenn. He had 3 commendations. 2 from the city and 1 from the governor's office. He had run into a furniture warehouse fire in 2009 that 4 other firefighters refused to enter, not out of cowardice but out of legitimate structural assessment, and Otis had disagreed with their assessment and gone in anyway and been right. He had been profiled in a fire service journal in 2014. He had mentored 11 younger firefighters who were now lieutenants and captains across the metro area. He had also, in the last 8 months, spent most of what he'd saved on his wife Luella's cancer treatment, and then on her funeral, and then on the debt the treatment left behind even after the funeral. His pension covered most of the month. Most. Not the insulin, not the Januvia, not the co-pays that had a way of arriving 3 at a time. He wasn't here because he was irresponsible. He was here because the system that asked everything from him had a very specific definition of what it owed him back, and that definition had gaps, and the gaps were where Otis Fenn was currently standing. The bell above the door rang. A man walked in out of the rain, pulling a hood back from his head, mid-30s, dark jacket, work boots that were actually designed for working, not fashion. He was carrying a small paper bag that he set on a chair near the door while he shook water off his sleeves. His name was Darius Okafor. He worked pipe fitting for a commercial contractor, and he had been in this pawn shop once before, 6 years ago, to sell a television when his hours got cut. He remembered the smell. He'd hoped not to be back. Darius had served 4 years in the Army, 3rd Infantry Division, before a roadside blast in Kandahar took some of the hearing in his left ear and sent him home with an honorable discharge and tinnitus that rang like a smoke alarm at 2 a.m. every night of his life. He didn't mention the Army to most people. It wasn't a secret. It just wasn't something he led with. He came in because he needed $200 to cover his truck payment before the grace period ended. In the paper bag was a watch, his father's watch, a Seiko his father had bought in 1987, the year Darius was born, the year his father started the first real job he'd ever had in this country. His father had worn that watch every day for 19 years. He'd left it to Darius in a shoebox with a note that said, in handwriting that still looked like the handwriting of a man who learned English as a third language, "This watch kept me on time. Now you keep it." Darius had kept it for 14 years in the same shoebox. He was going to sell it today because a truck payment was a truck payment, and without the truck, there was no job, and without the job, there was nothing. He stood near the door and waited, because Sproul was with the older man at the counter. Darius was not trying to listen, but the shop was small and the rain was loud and the conversation was happening 12 feet away. 40, Sproul said again. He slid the badge across the glass toward Otis. "That's my number." Otis looked at the badge. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it the way a man looks at a thing he has already decided to leave behind, cataloging it one last time. The city seal. The number 19. The year. "Okay," Otis said. Something in the way he said that word made Darius stop thinking about his own situation. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quietest kind of surrender. The kind that comes from a man who has been strong for so long that even his giving up is controlled and dignified. That was almost worse. If the man had been defeated and crumbling, it would have been easier to look away. But he was straight-backed and quiet and saying okay like he'd been trained to accept the unacceptable without making anyone around him uncomfortable about it. Darius had seen that posture before. He had worn that posture before. In a VA waiting room in 2019, filling out forms for hearing aids that took 11 months to be approved, telling himself it was fine, it was fine, it was fine, it was fine. He looked at the badge on the counter. He looked at the old man's hands. He looked at the rain outside. "Hey," Darius said. Sproul looked up. Otis turned, not expecting to be addressed. "Hold on a second," Darius said. He said it to both of them, but he was looking at Sproul. He walked to the counter. He stood next to Otis. Up close, he could see the city seal clearly. Department of the Year, 2003. Atlanta Fire Rescue. "This yours?" Darius asked Otis. Otis looked at him. "It is." "You a firefighter?" A pause. The specific pause of a man deciding how much of himself to give to a stranger. "Was," Otis said. 28 years. Darius was quiet for a moment. Then he asked very directly, "What do you need the money for?" It was a forward question, maybe even rude by some standards, but Darius asked it without judgment in his voice, just the way his sergeant used to ask questions. Flat, clear, actually wanting the answer. Otis studied him. "Medication." "How much do you need?" Another pause. Otis didn't want to answer that. There is something particular about having to state the exact number. It makes the gap between what you have and what you need too precise, too real. "More than 40, Otis said. Darius reached into his jacket. He had his wallet in his inside pocket. He opened it. He counted what was there. Here's what was there, $83 in cash. That was it. He had not yet been to an ATM, because the plan had been to get $200 from the watch and put $80 back in his account and use the rest for the truck. He put the $83 on the counter next to the badge. Otis stared at it. "I don't need," he started. "I know you don't need it," Darius said. "That's not what's happening here." Sproul looked between them. This was not the typical trajectory of his Wednesday afternoons. "That's 83, Darius said. "Not enough. But you keep the badge." Otis did not move for a long moment. He was looking at the money, and then at this man he had never seen before in his life, this younger man who had walked in out of the rain with his own reasons for being here, and who had just put what looked like most of what he had in cash on a pawnshop counter for a stranger. "Why?" Otis said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was something between a question and an accusation. The way you talk to someone who has done something for you that you don't yet know how to carry. "My dad worked 30 years in a textile plant," Darius said. "Nobody ever gave him a badge. You kept one for 28 years, and now you're selling it for $40. And that's not—" He stopped, rearranged what he was trying to say. "That's not right." Otis looked at the money. $83 would not solve the problem. It would solve about 3 weeks of the problem. But that was 3 weeks. And sometimes 3 weeks is what you actually need. Not a solution, just enough time to find one. He picked up the badge. He put it back in his coat pocket. He looked at Darius for a long time. "What's your name, son?" "Darius." "Darius." Otis said it like he was committing it. "You got family in this city?" "My mother, in Vine City." Otis nodded slowly. He reached out and put his hand briefly on Darius's shoulder. Not a long gesture, not sentimental, just a single firm contact the way older men sometimes communicate what they can't say at full volume. Then he picked up the cash from the counter. "I'll remember this," Otis said. "You don't have to remember it," Darius said. "Just don't sell the badge." Otis almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that his face hadn't moved since Luella died. He walked to the door, put his hood up, walked out into the rain. The door closed. The bell rang once and went quiet. Sproul looked at Darius. "You still need to sell something?" Darius looked at the paper bag by the door. He thought about his father's handwriting. "This watch kept me on time." "No," he said. "I'm good." He picked up the bag and walked out into the rain after the old man. He didn't catch up to Otis. He didn't try to. They went different directions in the parking lot, and that was fine, because this wasn't a story about two men becoming friends. It was a story about two men being decent in the same place at the same time, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most things you can put in a display case. But here is what happened after. Darius found another way to make his truck payment. He picked up a Saturday shift his foreman had been trying to fill for 2 weeks, and it paid time and a half, and it solved the number. The watch stayed in the shoebox. And Otis Fenn, that same week, got a phone call from a man named Lewis, who had been a junior firefighter under Otis at Station 11 in 2007 and was now running a nonprofit that helped first responders navigate benefits they were owed but had never applied for. Lewis had heard through someone that Otis was struggling. He didn't say who told him, and Otis didn't ask. And Lewis spent 90 minutes on the phone walking Otis through 3 separate benefit applications that Otis had not known he was eligible for. One of them covered medication. Within 6 weeks, Otis Fenn's insulin was covered. He kept the badge on his dresser. He looked at it in the mornings when he was getting dressed. Some mornings it was just a piece of metal. Other mornings it reminded him that he'd walked out of a pawn shop on Decatur Street with it still in his pocket because a man he'd never met decided his history was worth more than the price Sproul had put on it. He never found out what Darius had come in to sell. He never knew about the watch in the paper bag, or the truck payment, or the father who'd bought a Seiko in 1987, the year his son was born, and worn it every day for 19 years. But Darius knew. And there are moments, not often, maybe twice a year, when Darius is at the register at a grocery store or pharmacy, and the person in front of him is counting slowly, recounting, putting something back, doing the math out loud in the quiet way people do when they don't want anyone to notice that they're doing math. And Darius doesn't look away. He stays. He watches. He asks if he can help. Sometimes they say no, and that's fine. Sometimes they say yes. Either way, he stays close enough that they know someone is there, and that they are not invisible, and that what they're going through in this moment has been seen by at least one person in the world who understands that getting to the end of the week sometimes takes everything a person has, and that should be witnessed, not ignored. That's what 28 years in a burning building looks like when it finally comes back around. That's what a father's watch is worth when you decide not to sell it.